Alright, so if you're going to use SpecFlow the right way, you have to organize it in a certain way, and you got to know what you're doing because it's a skill like most other pieces of programming. So you can't just pick it up and start using it just because you know how to write unit tests. And basically, I had to learn how to use it, and what I'm showing now is, or what I'm going to show, is the framework that I've come up with. And it's not just my idea, some of the other people I work with kind of helped come up with this idea as well. But this is the framework within which we work, and we've seen that it works really well. It keeps the tests organized. It helps you find where your step definitions that already exist are, and then it helps basically keep the code really clean. Which these can be really hard to do if you're writing SpecFlow tests in a bad way. You end up eliminating a lot of reusability and maintenance whenever you don't do things the right way. So that's why I'm trying to kind of just note this down so that it can be used by other people, hopefully. So what I've got pulled up is just kind of a test solution. So I've got this web application, which would be representative of some APIs that you'd be testing. So let me just pull this up real quick. Controllers. It's got a books controller and a movies controller. So these are kind of the ideas where I literally haven't done anything in here with these. But that's the idea, is that you've got some sort of books API that you want to test and a movies API that you want to test. And that's represented by this web application. And then here is where our actual tests are. So you can see the little, what is this, Erlenmeyer flask. That's the unit test project. So this is where the framework is going to be set up. And I've actually got all the little components set up already. I'm gonna walk through and explain what each of these is. So when it comes to SpecFlow, obviously the centerpiece is the feature files. So this is where basically your application is comprised of a set of features, and when you're writing SpecFlow SpecFlow scenarios, you're basically testing these features. So that's why we start off with this features file. This is kind of the centerpiece for the entire SpecFlow testing framework. And so you can see, first of all, the most important thing to note here, or one of the most important things, is the way in which I've organized this feature file. So, or no, sorry, this folder. This folder is what we're referring to. So we've got this features folder, and within this, we've got these other folders, basically. So we've got books, login, and movies. And you can see immediately that basically what's happening here is that I'm organizing each set of features by the domain in which, basically by the domains in the application. So if you go back to this application, we can see we've got this books domain and this movies domain. And so what you want to do is you want to organize your feature files based on the domains of the application and kind of keep them in sync, because that's the way that you think about the application. You think about it in terms of the domains, right? And so that's why you want to organize your tests in this way. And so if I open up this books folder, for example, you can see I've got both my feature file in here and also my step definitions in here. And the same situation with login. Now, login itself doesn't have a feature file, but it does have steps. And then finally, movies has its feature file and steps. And so this is key point number one, is that you want to organize your feature files based on the application domains. Now, and the reason I bring this up is because what I've seen is that they'll have a folder called features, and they'll put all of the feature files for all domains underneath it, and then they have a separate folder called steps, and then they'll put all their step definitions under it. But the problem with this is that then basically you're mixing up, you're organizing based on the file type instead of organizing your test based on the domain of the application. And the biggest problem I've seen with that is that it becomes really hard to identify what steps already exist and which ones don't exist. And if you can't do that, if you can't identify those things within a SpecFlow framework, what's going to end up happening is that they won't be able to find the steps that already exist, so they end up creating another one. And then you'll end up having 3 or 4 or 5 different implementations of the same exact, basically, you're basically implementing the same thing multiple times because you can't find the original ones. And so organizing your features in this way is, I've found, is the best way to, first of all, it's the best way to understand it, and it's the best way to find things. So that's the point number one. So the second biggest piece of this SpecFlow framework is this concept of context. And basically, the easiest way to illustrate this is to kind of start delving into one of these features and one of these scenarios. So I've already written out a couple of these, so let's just look at this books feature here. Scenario number one, requesting a certain set of books should return the expected books. So given I have logged in as Tom, when I search for the top 10 books by typing in Harry Potter, then the application should return 7 books, and each of the books should have Harry Potter in the title. So this is one scenario that we're dealing with. And you can see there's multiple things going on. First of all, there's this idea that I have to log into the application, and then I've got to perform some sort of search function, probably by typing into a search box. And then my actual assertions in the test, which is that verifying that the API returned me the expected number of books and the expected books themselves. So this is what we're dealing with, is multiple kind of contexts here. One of these contexts is the login context, and then the other one is kind of this books context. And that is where these context objects come into play. So you can see when I open this context folder, I've got what's called a books context, a login context, and a movie context. So first thing we deal with is this given I have logged in as Tom, which clearly corresponds to the login context. And so you can see what the login context holds is this token and this tenant ID. And this would basically represent your current session as Tom. So the token would be saying, okay, you're logged in, here's his token, and giving him the authentication or authorization to access the APIs. And then the tenant ID specifies basically who does Tom belong to. So that's what these ideas are. Now, obviously, the login context could be different depending on the application, but that's the principle here, is that it holds whoever's logged in, it holds his state. Then what we've got for this, the rest of what's going on in here deals with books. And so what we've gotten here in this books contest is basically a list of books. And what that's going to give us is that it's going to hold basically the results of my search. So I'm saying when I search for the top 10 books, what's going to happen is I'm going to store the search results on this books context. And so that's going to hold the state of basically what I've been doing and what my interactions with the books API have been. And so the easiest way to kind of make that a little less abstract is to start walking through this thing. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through step by step. So given I have logged in as Tom, well, first of all, if we look in features, you know exactly where you can find that. Of course, you can always just go to right-click and go to definition, but the other thing you can do is come over here and say, of course, it would belong under the login folder, and then login steps. And so, given I have logged in as Tom, so what are we doing here? So this is pretty straightforward. You just construct some sort of request, send the request to this login service, and then you get the response, and that response is going to contain the token and the tenant ID. Now, this is where the context objects come into play, because you can see I've got this login context up here, and I'm setting the token and the tenant ID of that object based on what I got in that response. So that is going to populate the state of the login. So now if I go back to the feature, go to step number 2, when I search for the top 10 books, well, if I go to that step definition, let me find it here. Here it is. So what's going on here is this is another API request, but this time it's to the books API. So that's why we're using this books service. Now, in order to make this request to the book service, you can see that it requires a tenant ID and a token. And of course, where we're going to get those is from the login context that we dealt with, which we just populated from the first step. And so you can see, once again, in this file, I've got the login context, and that's what I'm using to populate the tenant ID and the token of this request to the books API. And so the whole idea here is that you can't send a request to the Books API without first being authenticated. And so you need to populate the login state before you send this request. And that's what these context objects help to facilitate. And then you can see finally that once I send the request to the Books API, I'm going to set the list of books on the Books context to what I got from the response. So that keeps track of basically what my search results were. And the reason that becomes necessary is because then I've got these assertion steps. So in order to perform my assertions, I need to have a handle on what was returned from the API. And so if I go to this step here, you can see I'm expecting some certain number of books, and I'm comparing that against an actual number of books, which is what I've set on this books context. So this is holding the actual state, and then I'm performing the assertion against this expected number. And so that kind of is how that's the whole idea behind this context object, is it holds the state of what you've been doing within a scenario. That way you can either utilize that state to kind of perform more actions, or utilize the state to perform whatever assertions you need to perform in your test. So that's the whole idea behind these things. And that's why I've got them in this context folder here, is basically what you can do a lot of times is you can, in the same way that you organize the features by domain in here, a lot of these contexts will also be organized by domain. So you've got the books context, which corresponds to the books domain, and then the movies context, which corresponds to the movies domain. And so they kind of align really neatly there. So this kind of leads to the next big concept in this framework, which is how do you share these data across multiple step definitions, right? Because SpecFlow provides multiple ways of state sharing across steps, but with this particular framework, I found that there's one good way of doing it. And you can see right here, I've got it pulled up. The way in which I'm referring to is this context injection, or dependency injection, which is how most people understand it. So what you'll see, so here I am in this book steps. If I go over to login steps, you'll also notice that I'm doing constructor injection here, and then the same thing over in this movie steps. I haven't actually done anything in here, but once again, I've got a constructor and I'm injecting some objects into it. So that's the whole idea within this framework, is that you want to use dependency injection because SpecFlow provides it, and you want to take advantage of that. And so if you wonder, so if I'm populating the login context in this file, how am I getting that same context over in this file? Well, that's coming from the SpecFlow's dependency injection framework. So basically, when I run this scenario, SpecFlow is going to inject an instance of this login context object, and when I make modifications to it on this side, well, it's going to inject that same object over on this side as well, and that's what's going to give me a handle on the state, even though I'm in a different file and in a different step. So that's kind of the next key point, is that you want to inject these things. Now, by default, SpecFlow will allow you to inject these types of context objects because there's nothing special about them. They're just POCO objects. Where SpecFlow is not going to handle by default is this situation, which is the interface situation. So obviously, with any dependency injection framework, if you inject an interface, somewhere you need to specify what that interface is going to resolve to. And it's no different in SpecFlow. And so the way I do that is, what I have is this bindings folder, and I've got a file in there called container setup binding. So I'm going to pull that up, and you can see what's going on here. So this is where I'm resolving these interfaces, or this is where I'm telling SpecFlow how to resolve these interfaces. And so what SpecFlow has is this iObject container, and what you can do in here is you inject that into the constructor of this class. And then what I have is this before scenario tag, which is going to say, okay, before any of the scenarios execute, run through this block of code. So what it's doing is, so what I'm doing basically is I'm saying, okay, I've got this iBook service interface, and I'm going to instantiate it to new book service. And then with my object container, I'm going to register this interface as being this implementation. So that's really how this ends up working. And then, so basically doing this right here is what allows me to, over on this side, to inject this interface. Because if I don't do this, then SpecFlow is going to say, I don't know how to resolve this interface. So that is that's how you use dependency injection, and that's how I think it should be done, and that's how I do it. Now, there's another thing as well. Let me see if I still got this. No, I don't have it anymore. There may be a situation, basically, where you need to interact with the test context, which is just, it's MS test context. And basically, the only way you can interact with test context within the context of bindings is you have to do it in a given block. So instead of a before scenario, it needs to be a given. And maybe I'll go into this at some other time because I don't have the code anymore. But basically, if you have to deal with this test context object, you have to handle things a little differently in here. But other than that, this will work, and it'll resolve these interfaces, which I'll show in a second. Okay, so right now, so far, what I've gone over, 3 major things, which is 1 is the way you organize your feature files. 2 is the idea of these context objects, which hold the state at each point in time when you're executing steps. And then 3 now is this usage of context injection and then the dependency injection framework that SpecFlow provides. So what else do we have in here? So these other things, these are pretty straightforward. This config file is basically, you're going to probably be running your automation testing against multiple environments. So config would be where you put the configuration for each of those environments. So I've just got a sample in here, which is an integration environment, a QA, and a UAT environment. So that's where you would have the specific config for those ones. Then there's this data, which is basically sometimes your test will make use of static data. So I would put most of that data in here. So here's just a sample, books.json. And then utilities is basically, utilities would be things that multiple of your step definitions can use, and that you're basically extracting that code out so that it can be used across multiple step definitions. So here I've got this, I shouldn't have called it books utility. I actually meant to call it books JSON reader, but the idea with this is that it'll basically read these JSON files or data files that you provide, and it will translate them from JSON to C# objects. So that's what this is doing, is it's looking at that file and using newtonsoft.json, it deserializes it into, I shouldn't call this a balance sheet either, I should call it books. So it's deserializing that JSON basically into a list of books. And this books JSON reader could be used anywhere throughout your tests. So again, the whole idea of utilities is basically what are certain utility classes that can help making your test easier and more maintainable. And then the final one that I missed was transforms, which this is something you can read about in the SpecFlow documentation. But step argument transformation is basically saying that when you have, let me pull up a table. When you have a table that looks like this, you can translate it directly instead of reading it, where am I? Instead of reading it as a book, or sorry, instead of reading it as a table right here, you can read it as a book right here if you add a transform, which will basically transform that table into a book. So that's the idea of step argument transforms, and there's plenty of documentation on those, but what I do is I put those in a folder called transforms. So that's the overall organization of the framework itself. Now, Within the automation framework as well, what I've got, you can see I've got the tests here. What else I've got is the models, which is basically if you've got your own, within your automation framework, if you've got your own set of models that are different, not necessarily different from the application's models, but you've got your own implementations of them, you would put them in a separate CS project from the tests. So I've just got them in a models project, and you can see that's where I got my books model, and I've also got my movie model, and then this idea of an I authenticated request, which means it's got a token. And then the third CS project would be your service clients, which is basically these are the libraries that you create that are going to make API requests out to your APIs and then return the responses. And so I organize this in a certain way as well, which is, once again, you can see it's organized by domain. Within each domain, I've got a folder called requests and one called responses. And then I've got the actual interface that we're using. So you can see the interface, the way I set the interface up is always, I've got a request object and a response object. And that brings a lot of consistency to the way you're making your requests within your actual tests. And then got my implementation here, which I haven't actually implemented, it's just mock data. But this would be where you call out to the API. And then here's the requests themselves. So basically the idea is you've got a separate project for your service clients that interact with your APIs. Each one of these is organized by domain, and then they've all got requests, responses, and then the interfaces and implementations. So that's really all of this concept. Let's see here. I guess what I'll do is I'll debug through this test just to show how it works real quick. And it does fail. I've already run it, but it fails for an expected reason. So let me see here. I don't know why my test explorer is showing like that. Oh, you know what? I gotta pull this down, that's why. Alright, so I'm gonna debug through this first scenario just to walk you through and to show you how it's working. Let me make sure I have a breakpoint. Oh, I don't have the right breakpoint. Hold on. So the first breakpoint I'm gonna put is here. You can see when I start to debug through this test, what happens is, first thing it's going to do is it hits this before scenario block, and that is where I'm registering all my bindings with the dependency injection container. Then I'm going to go to the login step. So here I'm in this login steps class, and I'm basically sending a request out to the login service. I get this is mock data right now, but I get these back and I set it on this login context object. Then you can see when I hit this book steps class, what it's going to do is it first hits the constructor, which is going to inject the data in the login context, you can see here. And then it also injects the book service, the implementation that I register with the container, before hitting my step. So here is where we perform the query, and we're making use of our state as well as whatever we passed it in the step. Set the response on the books context, and then we can perform our assertions. So checking the number is good, which it is, and then checking this, which this part fails because I wrote it badly. But the idea is, you get the idea. So, oh, and one more thing too I didn't mention is this is using, right here, these assertions are using this library called Fluent Assertions, which you should look into if you're not familiar with it, because I started using it recently and it's really good. But yeah, that's the whole thing. So I think it's a really good framework. I'm sure there's ways to improve it, but I found that this works really well, and it makes things really easy to use. So give it a shot.